Ornstein, whom I understand, as I saw all of you react to him outside, seems to know a lot of you already. So it gets around, I suppose, in a good way. So he's a pediatric hospitalist, assistant professor in Department of Pediatrics, and serves as the chief medical information officer at Children's, which personally I'm thrilled at. He's been a real rainmaker when it comes to making some really great positive changes that are research friendly. So he completed his undergraduate degree at Yale, where he worked in a mathematical epidemiology lab focusing on infectious disease modeling. He received his medical degree from Emory, and he spent over a year in Mali working on a clinical trial of maternal influenza immunization and studying its cost effectiveness. During his pediatric residency at CHOP, he co-founded the New EPIC Resident Development Squad. Does anyone know what the acronym is for that? The Nerd Squad, a partnership of pediatric residents and informatics faculty dedicated to involving frontline clinicians more deeply in designing and evaluating new workflow tools in the electronic health record. Genius, right? His clinical informatics interests include reducing medical errors and providing provider burnout from redundant documentation, improving physician efficiency and effectiveness with the EHR, through simulation cognitive informatics to improve the usability of documentation and decision support interfaces, and building capacity in clinical informatics locally and globally. From an from a research perspective, his goal is to improve patient safety and decrease physician burnout through innovations in EHR design and education. And impressively, if that wasn't all enough, he is currently NIH funded for work to improve influenza vaccine uptake in acute care settings and towards developing clinical decision support analytics tools to drive positive clinical outcomes. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Evan Ornstein for his talk on leveraging EPIC for your research.
Thanks very much, Stacy. Thank you. You can applaud as long as you like. Awesome. So I'm really excited to be here with you guys because I find that the fellows here are incredibly smart, have a ton of energy, and really I will go ahead and start and let you know my underlying goal is to recruit you into working in clinical informatics and becoming somebody who understands how to use the electronic health record to move the needle on quality improvement work and research work. And I really think if you build these skills, it can be catalytic and just make you so much faster and more efficient at doing the kinds of things that you want to do. So sort of the alternative title of this is I really do think your time is valuable, and I don't want you to do chart reviews except when you kind of really have to. So how can we leverage all this work and all these data that we're putting in discreetly to do a little bit better? First of all, just to start with disclosures, I am a co-founder and have equity in a company called Phrase Health. I will mention it briefly during this conversation. I'll re-mention this at that time. And with that group, I'm a principal investigator on a couple of grants from the NLM and NCATS on that. So first of all, what is clinical informatics? Just by raise of hands, how many of you guys have heard of clinical informatics before walking in here? Wow, that is very different from the past. That's really interesting. So it's a relatively new discipline. The fellowship in it only started in 2014. But essentially, it's this intersection between clinical care, health systems, and all the operations that make things go, and information services and technology. So if anybody wants to do another fellowship, you could do a 2-year fellowship. We have had some fellows do a second fellowship in clinical informatics, actually. And you get training in not just information services and technologies, but these health system needs, and learn again to kind of become what I think is more efficient in sort of the improvement cycle. So we'll talk about today, we'll talk about the learning health system. We're going to spend some time getting into the guts of how EPIC works. And the reason we're going to do that is because I want to talk about how to get data out of the electronic health record, how to intervene in the electronic health record, and then, as I mentioned, my long-term goal is really to recruit you into the Geek Squad, which is the new version of the Nerd Squad, which is helpful for me, and selfishly I just need your help, but I think also hopefully helpful for you guys in accomplishing what you're interested in. So starting with the learning health system, I think a lot of people have different definitions for that, but the basics for me are that on the one hand, there is the front line of care where people are using electronic health records and those data are going into databases. There is a discovery process where we can use all those data to gain insights and say this is some evidence-based practice we should be doing, and then we should be changing the design of the electronic health record for impact so that we can have improve the outcomes that we're interested in. And really, we're doing that to achieve sort of the quadruple aim from AHRQ, right? Better outcomes for our patients, improve clinician experience, lower costs, and improve patient experience. Now, I want to talk about how technology, I think, classically gets done and how I hope it gets done. So classically, a clinical stakeholder would say, hey, I have a new idea for this technology. Very commonly, I want an alert that does X. Usually I want to alert the emergency department to think about my disease process, right? That's what everybody wants to do. And then that request goes to an analyst, and the analyst evaluates it and builds it, and they kind of put it out into the world. And we kind of have no idea what happens, right? And so what ends up happening is that work as imagined is often very different from work as done. When you're sitting in a committee meeting and talking about how people do work, it's very different from being out on the floors. Things malfunction, and especially in the area of the pandemic, things become obsolete incredibly quickly. And that's bad, right? That leads to things we don't want. So the alternative model to me is that, we'd have clinical stakeholders and analysts who work with, you guys, and you don't just design something, but you do observation and data analytics that we'll talk about in a bit to come up with what that technology should really look like, where you really understand what the user needs and what the task is that you're trying to move the needle on. You put it out into the world in a way that gives you data, and then that comes back to you and you iterate and change that technology, right? And that's sort of the fellow in the loop approach to technology development that I think will lead us to efficiency, safety, and quality. So let's talk a little bit, excuse me, about the EHR data process, right? In general, what happens is, somebody comes up with a question, you go to some data source, you pull back data, you do some verification process, and that maybe leads you to more questions, right? And I like to think of this, actually, I think the discipline this is closest to is really archaeology, right? There is some care that happens on the front lines. We leave behind these ruins of what we did and didn't do, and then we're trying to examine those ruins and come up with some understanding of what actually happened, right? So we want to understand how that process really works so you guys can kind of do this more efficiently. How can you ask your question in a better way that gets you to sort of the cheapest data source to answer your question that an analyst understands really well so that when you do your verification, you're more likely to get what you're interested in. So now we're going to talk about kind of how Epic works, and I stole a lot of this from a guy, Phil Hagedorn at Cincinnati Children's. So, excuse me, I have a little, it's not COVID, I promise. It's something my daughter gave me. So, Epic runs on a database called Chronicles, and this is, you don't have to worry too much about the terms, but it's a hierarchical database with real-time data. So what I mean by that is when you are in Epic and you place an order, that is immediately making a change in the underlying database. It's got an order ID, it's got, what medication you chose and what dose and all this information. And when you go to a different screen that looks at all the active orders, for example, that screen is basically referencing the database and saying, show me all the active orders, one of which will be the new one that you just entered. So what that looks like, what's called Chronicles, is it's structured in what Epic calls master files. And Epic likes to think of it as, imagine a paper system where you have filing cabinets and you've got information about the patients, and maybe you've got a different filing cabinet with information about medications. And the idea is you might have one patient here. Here's Jimmy patient. They've got items and values that are attributes of that patient. They've got a date of birth. They've got a gender. They might have different problems, right? And each of those problems links out to a different master file that describes that problem, right? So Jimmy patient has diabetes. There's another master file that describes diabetes and says, it's type 1 diabetes, and it's got this ICD code, and it maps to this other code, et cetera. And similarly, here's all the orders that have ever been placed. And each order has its own master file that describes, is it an active order? What was the order for, et cetera. So it's what we call a hierarchical database, and it's optimized for what we call depth-first searching. And what I mean by depth-first searching, is that it's really good at asking a lot of questions about one patient at a time, okay? And in your clinical work, that's what you want, right? In clinical work, you're looking at one patient at a time, and you want to know all their meds and all their what have you. it's not necessarily as efficient for asking a question across many patients at a time, right? If you wanted to ask a question about medication orders for people with diabetes, the computer has to kind of dive into each patient, and then it's got to dive into each problem and say, is that diabetes? Is that diabetes? And then it's got to dive into each order and say, is that the, insulin that you were interested in or whatever it was? It's kind of a slower process. So it's good at depth first searching. It's not great at breadth first searching, meaning searching across patients. This is what it actually looks like. So you can actually take classes in this, which I'll talk about at the end. And this is an EMP record, an employee record for this guy, Phil Hagedorn. It's got information about his user number, his name, what access he has, if he's active or not, if he's on the project team, all these sort of key item and value pairs. And there's lots of these different master files. So he works at Cincinnati at one of the hospitals called Liberty, which has this facility list. And so the Liberty Hospital, it's got its own formularies and preference lists. And you can basically link through all of these hyperlinks and say, okay, what are the injectable medications that are available at Liberty? And it'll give you sort of that big list. So that's kind of how it's connected through all these networks, good again at depth first searching. Now, you guys often want to do quality improvement or research is you want to ask a question across lots of patients at the same time. And so what happens is Chronicles every night at midnight dumps all of its data, or almost all of its data, into a different database that Epic calls Clarity. And that is a relational database with a normalized data model. So what does that mean? What's a relational normalized database? What we mean by that is it's got lots of different tables with rows and columns, okay? And each table has a particular primary key. So for example, this might be the orders table right here. This might be the encounters table. And this might be a different table that has more information about medication names. And what these do is they allow you to join across tables, okay? So if I start with, I'm interested in encounters that were admitted between June and July 2021, I've got one table that tells me all of those. Then if I want to say, I want to know among those who got insulin, I can link to a different table that's got the orders, and then I can link again a different time from the medication ID to a different table that describes the details of the medication. So it's normalized because each table has sort of the minimal information needed for that concept. And if you want to answer a real question, you are often joining across many, many tables. So this could get really complicated. So if you're interested in readmissions, for example, unplanned readmissions, this is sort of the schema and all the tables and joins that have to be made to answer the question, what's going on with readmissions, for example. But the advantage is it has everything, super granular. So whatever question you're asking, if it can be answered, it can generally be answered by that database. The last thing Epic does is they move everything to a database they called Caboodle. And that is a dimensional data model that is a little bit easier to explore and report from, although doesn't quite give you the same level of detail. Excuse me. So what's a dimensional data model? A dimensional data model is based on facts. So facts is the occurrence of a specific measurable event. So if you place a medication order, right, there is a moment in time, a timestamp where I can say, you place that medication order for albuterol. And there are lots of dimensions about that medication that I can attach to it, right? I can say, what date was it? What time of day was it? What department was the patient in? What was the provider? Who was the patient? Et cetera. And the key here, we're going to talk about this a little bit more, is the unit of analysis is relatively fixed in these dimensional data models. So, you can't from here very easily ask the question of, I want to know the time difference between this medication type of order for this patient and that medication order for this type of patient. But if you want to ask questions like, how often are we ordering inhaled tobramycin for our cystic fibrosis patients, you can answer those types of questions from here. So I'm going to pause there because I realize that's kind of deep in the weeds. That's the part you're supposed to fall asleep for. And questions on sort of Chronicles, Clarity, Caboodle. Yeah. Oh, that's your a head scratch. Well done. Very, yeah, good one. Got me. Any other questions? All right. So the reason I tell you all that, why did I bore you with all that, is because I want to understand those data models tells you a little bit about what's easy to collect and what's difficult to collect when you're making a request. So things that are easy tend to be things that have kind of very clear timestamps, right? Medication orders or administrations or lab orders or vital signs. If you want to know, how many patients had vital signs above this number, that's a relatively easy thing. It's discrete, it's got a timestamp associated with it, and we can figure it out relatively easily. Things that are sort of medium difficulty. Diagnoses are also technically timestamped. There's a moment where you put the diagnosis in, but I put it in the medium category because the moment you put a diagnosis in is very often not the same as the moment when they developed that diagnosis. And so whenever you want to say patients with these diagnoses, we have to be a little bit more specific about, you mean a billing diagnosis, an admission diagnosis, a problem list diagnosis. There's sort of a lot more information we need to be able to answer that question. Time intervals. Many quality projects and research projects, people are interested, how long did it take from the time they arrived in the ED with asthma until they got prednisone? How long was it till they, the blood culture was taken for sepsis and we gave the antibiotic? Time intervals are a little bit difficult to do with those dimensional data models. And then finally, things that I would call hard are if you're trying to extract information out of notes or how long people spend in notes or what screens they viewed. This is doable, but they're difficult. So things that are easy, you can generally get out of a dimensional database. Things that are medium, you generally need to get to a relational database and spend more time specifying exactly what you want. And things that are hard, you're combining a relational database with natural language processing, machine learning, some of these other techniques that are just more resource intensive. So questions about this slide. This is one of my kind of big take home points for you guys. All right. We'll keep going. So now I want to talk to you just about the different kinds of data sources that are available to you that you can use. And this is not comprehensive, but it has several. I specifically did not do much with REDCap because you have a separate talk coming on that in a second. So the three big dimensional data sources that I think are really helpful are Epic's slicer dicer functionality, PopDisco, and then Phrase Health. And as a reminder, that is the company I have equity in. So first, Slicer Dicer. So Slicer Dicer is within Epic Tool, and you can get to it if you go to chart search and you just type Slicer Dicer. It'll say jump to Slicer Dicer, and you can click on it, and it'll show up a screen that looks something like this. You're selecting a data model. You're selecting a dimensional data model. And what you're doing when you're selecting this is you are selecting the unit of analysis or the granularity of what you're interested in. So for example, if you are interested in length of stay for patients who have a particular diagnosis, which of these dimensional data models do you think is at the right unit of analysis to ask a question like length of stay? Sorry? Admissions, right? A length of stay is associated with admission. Each admission has exactly one length of stay, right? You can't choose patients. Patients might have multiple length of stay. They might have multiple encounters. You can't choose outpatient prescriptions, right? That doesn't, that doesn't have a length of stay necessarily associated with it. If you wanted to ask a question like, what proportion of, what's the change in the number of opioid prescriptions that we're prescribing over time? Yeah, I guess I cheated. I used the word opioid and it's right there. Anyway. So the point of this is you need to think carefully about sort of which data model you're going to select based on the unit of analysis or the granularity of whatever question you're asking. And the way I think about that is, if I'm interested in time to prednisone for ED admissions, I want to, in my ultimate database, I would like each row to represent one ED admission, and I would have the time from arrival until prednisone. If I am interested in blood transfusion ordering errors, right, then I don't want each row to be an encounter, because a single patient may have multiple blood administrations. I want each row to be maybe a single transfusion or maybe a single transfusion order. So you want to be really thoughtful about, when I have my table to answer this question, what is that granularity or unit of analysis I need? So anyway, what happens, you select one of these data models. So let's say you select the patient's data model. It'll give you sort of all the patients. And then first you can define your population or your cohort here. And there's a bunch of criteria you can select over here to do that. You can then what they call slice. So if I want to see different bars by race or ethnicity or something else, I can put those criteria into here. I can then say, what measures am I interested in? And one of the common errors I see is the measure you're interested in is not associated with the data model you're interested in, right? I can't look for a measure of length of stay, or I think it's total duration of stay is how it shows up, in the patient's data model. It just doesn't make sense. And then finally, I have lots of different ways of visualizing it with bar graphs. And something missing from here is actually there's a cool geographic visualization. So if you're interested in where do kids with high risk for COVID conditions live, you can click a button and actually get a zip code map of that as well, sort of built into here natively, which is cool. Here are some of the dimensions that we have built in already and some of the future dimensions we're working on. And our team's, Tal in particular, is working on some of our custom data models that meet kind of our local definitions for things that you guys might find interesting. How to get access, you should already have it. You just type Slicer Dicer in the chart search at the top right of Epic. Do you guys know what chart search in Epic? That's familiar? Okay, it's at the top right, or you can hit Control Space and get there. All right, any questions about Slicer Dicer? Yeah. Yeah, so great question. So many of the data models are built by Epic. The challenge is Epic assumes you're on what they call foundation, and so they build it assuming that we haven't customized, and we've customized like crazy. So for many of those, if you can look at it and validate, you can automatically get another institution and say, hey, run it just like I did here. Not every institution has mapped all their data models. And then what many institutions are doing, us included, are starting to build some custom data models to say, we've validated sepsis here's exactly how we're defining it. And that is doable across institutions, but does take a little bit more work to make sure the way we've defined it kind of fits how they did. Great question. Other questions? Right. Okay. So the next I'll show you is population discovery, and this is another sort of dimensional data model. And I would say this is sort of Slicer Dicer before Slicer Dicer existed. And it allows you to search and filter along all these different dimensions. If you want to look at, particular visits who had this kind of diagnosis and you want to vary them by demographics, you can sort of click through these tabs and filter on stuff to get kind of everything you need. So this is, for example, what the visits table looks like. You could say I'm only interested in ED visits, or I'm only interested in CICU visits, or a lot of really good special populations. So I'm only interested in those with a complex chronic condition or a particular guideline population, people who met the criteria for our appendicitis guideline or what have you. So we have a lot of sort of validated special populations in here that you can use and then go answer many of these other questions like inpatient length of stay or what have you. These are the major dimensions that are in there. So we have visits, we have diagnoses, chief complaints, microbiology, respiratory pathogens, et cetera. So a lot of information. This is, I would say, very useful for sort of like gathering preliminary data for your grants, right? If you need to know counts of visits of people who have this set of criteria so that you can apply for this grant and say, yes, we have the volume to answer the question I'm interested in, this is a great place to answer that type of thing. Again, it's a dimensional data model. So if you are interested in complex time intervals, things like that, you may not be able to get kind of what you want out of here. Yeah, I think I highlighted the special populations that I think are particularly useful. So sickle cell and cancer, this links out to those validated registries, any of our clinical effectiveness guideline populations, et cetera. And how to get access. So every division should have sort of a quality champion in the process improvement department that you can reach out to. And they can either get you access to these data directly, or you can put in a data request, which I believe Tal's going to talk about a little bit more in his portion. Finally, I'll bring up one more. And again, this is the one that I have the financial interest is Phrase Health. And this is specifically clinical decision support analytics. So this is specifically how do alerts function, how do order sets function, medication orders, procedure orders, some new things coming down the pike that I haven't put into this presentation as well for quality improvement association of decision support. But the idea here is I can basically see all the alerts in our system and how many times they fired over whatever time period I'm interested in. I can click into each one and get a preview of sort of what it looks like. What does it look like for the end user? And probably the most useful part is I can get analytics on how are people selecting from this. And I can set filters. I can say who said to keep this alert active for them or who said they won't see this patient. And I can get lots of information. I can even get down to the individual encounters or users who saw a particular alert. So I can go ask them like, hey, this alert seems like it's really bothering you. What do you wish it did differently, for example? So this has dimensions of alerts, order set utilization. So if you're going to do a quality improvement project on the nephrotic syndrome order set, and you want to say, hey, nobody's ordering the lipid profile for patients coming in with nephrotic syndrome. Why is that? Maybe you can go look and see what's missing and see what you need to do about that. And then medication orders, procedure orders. There's also order panels have shown up in this as well more recently. How to get access, if you just go to app.phrasehealth.com and you put in your email address at emory.edu or at choa.org, it'll use single sign-on and give you access to this. So this is something you guys can get right now. Questions about the dimensional data sources? Yeah. Great question. Yeah. So for Slicer, Dicer, and really all of these dimensional data sources, there's, I guess Phrase Health has provider identifying information, but not PHI. So for all of these, you are getting counts. Slicer Dicer is actually probably even more robust, where if it's any count is less than 10, it won't show it to you. So if you're, you could theoretically identify, some rare disease and figure out who that is. So the short answer is you can go into any of those 3 data sources with absolutely no IRB, anything. You can do exploration, try to figure out what you're interested in working on. Yeah. If you want line level data and you want patient level information at that stage, you either need an IRB or a non-human subjects research determination, or working with a quality champion in a division, and they say yes, this is a divisional QI project. Question? Other questions? All right. So relational data sources. Clarity is sort of the big one that's across multiple Epic institutions. KIDS is our local enterprise data warehouse with some of the more validated definitions, and it populates that PopDisco and then REDCap as well. So again, just as a reminder of the Clarity database structure, it's multiple tables with keys, primary and foreign keys that link these things together. So, what does this look like? It looks like real code. So this can be a little bit intimidating, but getting to this level does require real code. So most of the time, this is going to be a data request to somebody else. That said, we have had several fellows take the courses, including Clarity courses, and start getting into this themselves. Again, I think it is incredibly just catalytic for your career if you're willing and interested in getting this kind of training to be able to go after the data and explore it yourself. So I definitely recommend it. What pops out of here generally are going to be tables. So this is an example of a SSRS report where, I'm interested in suspected COVID-19 patients. I'll have a table that pops out of this request that's got all the information I need. So, I think the key thing here is, again, to be really careful in your request about thinking what your unit of analysis is, because when you put this request in, it's going to go to Tal Senior, who has some clinical background and is great, but at some point there's going to be a report writer who's not necessarily clinical. And if you want this to come out and be useful to you, you want to be really careful with your request. And so a little exercise I like to do is to think about the unit of analysis and what the answers to these sorts of things, I think can be patients, encounters, patient days, orders, flow sheet entry timestamps. There's many things, but what I mean by the unit of analysis or the granularity is, what does one row in that database represent? So we'll do a little bit of practice. So let's start with lead screening. Let's say I'm doing a QI or a research project, and I am trying to make sure that by the age of 3 years old, kids have gotten, actually don't know what it is in Georgia. When I trained in Philly, they needed three leads. 3 lead levels. I guess I haven't done primary care here. But let's assume you moved to Philly and that's the recommendation. So what would be the right unit of analysis of the table that I eventually want? Yeah, it's probably patient, yeah. And if you think about it, that's not how the data is structured in its underlying structure, right? In its underlying structure, you're placing orders for leads. And most people will make this request and get 1 row per lead screen order, right? But that's not really what you want. You want that transformed, so you've got every patient and, how many lead screens did they have by age 3? 0, 1, 2, or what have you. So that's a good one. Let's do influenza vaccines. So now you are building decision support in ambulatory clinics that you think is going to promote flu vaccine, and you want to know if it's working. Yeah, so there's two probably right answers here. So I think encounter is probably the easiest, right? You could say, give me all the encounters that were eligible, and then tell me, did they get flu vaccine or not, right? The other way you could do this is if you have a known population and you want to ask, did they get vaccine this season? You could do it at the patient level. But you see how those are two similar but very different questions that are going to lead you to totally different data sets. So if you are interested in, how often does my alert or whatever get people to actually order and administer the flu vaccine, you probably want an encounter level metric. All right, what about CLABSIs? I'm doing an intervention. I'm building a predictive model. I'm going to predict CLABSIs, and I want to know if I'm lowering the CLABSI rate or not. So you could do it as encounter, but it's a little bit tricky, right? Because if you think about what I call the area of opportunity, right? Somebody might have a central line for 2 days in that encounter, right? Somebody else might have a central line for 100 days in that encounter, right? And those are probably two actually slightly different, those are different denominators, right? You expect more CLABSIs in the 100 days. So this is a situation where actually I think patient day is probably the right metric, right? You really want to know, I want each row to represent not just a patient, but a patient day 1 of their hospitalization, day 2, day 3, did they have a CLABSI on each of those days? And that will allow me to really understand, is my CLABSI rate improving? Does that make sense? That's a kind of confusing one. All right, and then one more, let's do blood transfusions. I did a project, I want people to order irradiation for blood transfusions more accurately. Order, very good, okay. So you want to think about that when you're actually making your request. What is the unit of analysis? What's the granularity of what I'm interested in? All right, how do you do that? You'll get a little bit more of this, but there is a specific URL that you can use to make, it's kind of a one-stop shop. So whether it's going to quality or research or finance or whatever, you put all of your requests in here and they get managed there. And I'm assuming you guys get these slide sets. So if not, let us know and we'll get this URL to you. All right. Okay, we've got a few more minutes. I think I have till what, I have till how long? 1 o'clock? 1:10. Okay, great. So let's talk about intervening in the EHR. And intervening in the EHR can be both to improve my data capture for my quality improvement or research initiative, or it can be because I actually want to intervene in the EHR to make something better, right? So first, it can facilitate data collection. So here's an example of a project by one of our former hospital medicine fellows who now is a clinical informatics fellow. So it is very doable. And she was interested in the bugs that grow for kids with osteomyelitis and some of these other infections. Are they different based on the patient's immune status? And can we use that to guide their decision support? So basically, in the musculoskeletal infection guideline, we just added this little hard stop question to say, hey, are they generally healthy, immunocompromised, or not immunocompromised? And people click that, and suddenly you've got at least one clinician's view of what this patient was like, kind of for your data. So it's relatively painless. She did some good usability studies to prove that, and allows you to get your data instead of having a research assistant, try to follow every admission and decide if they're generally healthy or not. You can integrate that into the workflow, and suddenly your QI project is something everybody's helping you with. Flow sheets. So here's an example. If you're working on unplanned extubations and you want to know, patients who have a high risk score based on this particular instrument, are those actually the patients who get unplanned extubations? Well, if you can get people documenting that score discreetly in flow sheets, then you can just have that automatically filing into Clarity. You just do a data request, and boom, you can get your answer, as opposed to you following around every intubated patient and saying, okay, what's their risk score, and let me tabulate them all and do this all manually. Smart forms. So this is an example similar to the other one, but for antimicrobial stewardship. If you are interested in understanding our antimicrobial use based on patient conditions and based on so host conditions and based on the phenotype of the infection that they have, if you gather it in a smart form, then those data are getting filed discreetly. And again, you can just have people do this in their clinical workflows, file those data, and you can just pull it. And then finally, another nice example, I think, is Smart Lists. So this is an example of one of the resident QI projects where they were interested in screening mothers for postpartum depression. And so we integrated into their notes basically a PHQ-2. So it started off as 2 questions. And then if that scored high enough, a PHQ-9. And you can basically, in Epic, people answer these questions and you can attach these smart data elements to them. And so now, again, every time somebody's signing a note, they are collecting discrete data for you. So instead of you having to mine these notes or survey people to ask them if they're screening or something like that, you've now got an automated, discrete way to answer your question, all right? And then finally, alerts are another way you can do that. So every time somebody builds an alert, I know you guys love them, you have to build a whole bunch of logic, and every time it fires, it discretely tells you which patient and what the timestamp was and what did the person do with that alert. You can also run these, I think I have a slide on this, in the background. So you could have, if you come up with, this is my cohort definition, and you can actually build some criteria and rules. You don't have to interrupt anybody or really tell anybody about it. You can build this as what we call a background alert. Every time it fires, it files that element, and boom, you can suddenly run an analytic report and calculate exactly who all those patients are and whatever other characteristics you're interested in. This is probably one of the most powerful, and it's nice because you're really not interrupting people's workflows. And it's really cool because this allows you to define a cohort, and then once you've defined that cohort and you want to intervene, hey, you've got your logic already to exactly define who they are and what you want to change in Epic. So this is this ability to sort of display to the user. You can say no. And that's kind of a really powerful one. The last one I'll mention is registries. So this is basically, you can build into Epic a registry that runs on sort of a batch job and basically asks a bunch of questions of every patient in the system. And it'll include, so this is an example of, who had COVID-19 confirmed is, okay, did they have an infection status active of this is COVID-19 confirmed? Did they have it resolved? Was their last positive SARS-CoV-2 test positive or negative in this particular time period? And then this will basically just run across all the patients in our whole system and create a list of everybody who meets those criteria for you. So automated ways of creating your cohorts of interest and your metrics of interest that don't require you to manually chart review. You probably still need to manually chart review a fraction of them to verify that it's working the way you want. But we built something similar to this for sexual history documentation. We had folks verify probably 100 to 200 charts, which was relatively quick, and then boom, suddenly their sample size was 3,000 to 4,000 because we can run this in an automated way. Questions about any of these methods? Yeah, go for it.
Part of the unplanned excavation as an example, you need to also bring in alert. There's an option for such alert for certain types of staff members. So like the RTs for assessing the airway, they have alerts they have to answer to. For nurses that physicians really have to see collect data from specific
Yeah, so there is a lot of granularity, and it's not just I only want nurses to see this or I only want respiratory therapists to see this. So you can do that, plus all these rules and criteria, and even more than that, you can do quasi-experimental designs of whatever your intervention is, right? You could say, okay, here's the phenotype where I want this alert to fire. I'm actually going to turn it on only at Scottish Rite and not at Eggleston, or the other way around. And suddenly, boom, I've got an intervention group and a control group who are pretty darn similar to each other. And I can ask some question and see if it moves the needle. So there is a lot of granularity that you can get into in building all of these. And so, for unplanned extubations, this may or may not have been a good thing, but we have an alert for respiratory therapists if this score isn't entered in a timely fashion. If they're over an hour or 2 hours late, I can't remember what it is, and they haven't entered this, only a respiratory therapist will see that alert and it can link them straight in here as an example, which worked to get them to fill out the score. Did it actually prevent unplanned extubations? Separate story. All right. Okay, cool. So the big principles of this, though, I would say, is when you're building these, workflow is more important than research. So as much as you care about your project, I love you guys, but nobody else cares about your project quite as much as you do. And they don't want to get interrupted, and they don't want to have to do extra work necessarily for your project. But if you can get them to buy in, and you can build it into the workflow in a way that really makes sense, it's really helpful. But if you don't have a good design, you get garbage data and you make enemies, which is bad. So in conclusion, what I'm really hoping is for you guys to be able to participate sort of in this loop, right, where you use observation and data to design maybe your technology interventions. You get data back on how people are using it, update it to promote efficiency, safety, and quality. I'm actually going to skip some of this for purposes of time. I do want to show one just good example of somebody who did this. This is Ben Siegel, who's a fourth year pediatric neuro resident on ketogenic diet medication errors. So for people like me who are simple hospitalists, the keto diet, right? It's a high fat, low carbohydrate diet, leads to ketosis. The brain uses ketones instead of glucose for fuel. Some magic happens, right? And then there's lower seizure frequency. Maybe some of you understand that piece. So the risk, of course, is if you give these patients sugary medications like sweet Tylenol, especially for the small ones, you can kick them out of ketosis and increase their risk of seizures, right? So this was a very cool thing that we developed. There was an alert when people opened the chart of patients with a ketogenic diet. So that was useful. We had a way to sort of automatically detect who they were, but it was kind of hard to read and nobody really used it, right? So here's where this critical information was telling you that you shouldn't use syrups, suspensions, elixirs, or chewable tablets for any of these patients. So what Ben did is basically said, okay, can we do a more targeted alert, not just when you open the chart, but when somebody's actually ordering a medication that we don't want them to and recommend the lower carbohydrate version. He did what we call formative usability testing. So he came up with a couple of scenarios, showed it to people in a simulated environment, watched what they did and iterated on the design. I like to point this out because he did that with PowerPoint. So he didn't do anything fancy. He just took some screenshots in Epic and you can kind of see where he made the edits and showed it to people and saw what happened. Came up with a design based on how people reacted in that feedback. And then, there's a lot of places where Epic really facilitates the research. So Alert on Chart Open gave him a cohort definition. The alert-based intervention, he could evaluate how that was working in a dimensional databases. And his data sources for the alert firings was able to use phrase health. And then his ultimate outcome metric was sort of how many carbohydrate containing medications per patient day. And that is a little bit more complicated. You couldn't get with a dimensional database, so had to build a Clarity report. But with very little effort could get, what are people doing when they see this alert? We could say, okay, 58% of the time they're removing the amoxicillin suspension, doing what we want them to do. So that's cool. And then with a Clarity report was able to quickly make sort of a statistical process control chart for how many of these orders were happening per day. We actually did intentionally stagger the implementation of that alert at Scottish Rite and Eggleston and saw a drop in medication errors at each hospital sort of corresponding. So this is the type of stuff I think you guys can absolutely do and run. It was done honestly as a resident and leverage Epic to do something I think that's more exciting. So finally, in closing, I do want to talk about just the Geek Squad, which is the graduate medical education in EHR coding squad. And basically, this is an opportunity to gain Epic certification. So we'd like everybody to pursue at least the Epic Physician Builder certification. That is, I will say, it's not tiny mining. It's 8 days worth of training. It is also development of, you do 2 Epic-based projects. They're not too terrible. They're probably 4 hours or so each. You can go beyond that and they have Physician Builder analytics training if you want to get better at using these tools, or even if you want to get really good, you can learn the Clarity data model for physician builders and be able to kind of write your own code. We give you access to the Epic development environment so you can start building your own stuff. You get mentorship from a board certified clinical informaticist, which we now have 5 of. And then we meet monthly as a Geek Squad. It's usually the first Wednesday of the month, but several of us were out of town this coming Wednesday, and then there's pediatric awards, so it's going to be November 17th. We meet at 5 p.m. They're still virtual right now. At some point, maybe we'll get together and have some food. We talk about clinical informatics concepts, Epic builds, people have questions, some kind of IS&T logistics, and what we spend most of our time doing is talking about works in progress or brainstorming. So I have an idea, this is what I want to do for my ShipQI project or research project. Help me think about how to do the problem analysis. Here's what I'm thinking of building in Epic. What would you guys recommend? We have had 6 fellows build something out of this and actually put it into production. So it's, real life. We've had at least 3 publications sort of resulting from fellows doing this sort of stuff. So I think it can be really cool. And finally, it gives you these pretty cool certifications when you're applying for a job to be like, hey, check it out. I can build cool stuff in Epic for you. You should hire me and you should protect my time and what have you. So finally, this is sort of our vision again as a reminder. And my last messages are try to understand your data sources. Dimensional data is easy to get. Relative data, relational data is relatively easy if you've got a good phenotype of what you're looking for. Chart review is for data validation. Chart review is not for most of your research. It's painful, it hurts, it's horrible. Data collection in Epic should enhance your workflow. You want to make useful tools that you can capture data discreetly. And then finally, you want to iteratively design both your data strategies and your intervention strategies. So I will pause there for questions. No, you can run those. It depends a little bit on exactly what question you're asking, but you can ask it retrospectively. So a simple example, we want, well, a new project I'm really excited about is we want to text 5 to 11-year-olds who have high-risk conditions and say, hey, you should get, the vaccine's going to get approved. You in particular should get a COVID vaccine, right? We can retrospectively get everybody who has one of those high-risk conditions or a complex chronic condition. Yeah, so short answers, no. Other questions? Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And in fact, all of your program directors have at some point at least received an invite and should have pushed them down to you. Hopefully they did. And so all the program directors are aware. If you want to do it, it's definitely something I would talk with your program director about because you will need some sort of dedicated time, particularly to complete the training and what have you. But even before you complete the training, you can start joining and learning. And then for most of you who maybe have a little bit more time in your second year or whatever it is, you can get the training and start building actual projects and move things along. So I realize I didn't put my email address or anything in here, but if you're interested, just email me and I'll give you all the information for how to look up the courses and start getting yourself scheduled and what have you. Two actually did. Yes, 2 fellow Warshaw Research Awards from this. Yeah. They did a good job. Awesome. Thank you guys so much.